I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. My name is Bobbie McIntyre and this is Eloise Bowen, and we are two of the Department of Education Speech Language Pathologists from the Central Queensland Region based here in Gladstone.
Throughout our presentation today, we hope to offer some insight into our role, early communication development, and a new resource that is currently under construction. Specifically, we will share information on the DOE SLP role, what is speech and language, importance of speech and language, how to support speech and language, and ERTL, the Early Years Resource for Talking and Listening project. As speech pathologists, we support students with communication and swallowing difficulties in the following areas: fluency, voice, swallowing, AAC, speech, language, and literacy. There are many different types of facilities and services where speech pathologists can be employed, and often the key elements of the role differs across settings. Within the Department of Education, speech pathologists offer the following: specialist skills to undertake differential diagnostic assessments regarding the nature of speech, language, and communication difficulties, to identify impact on ability to access, participate, and achieve in learning, identify most appropriate adjustments and support to implement, support inclusive education to work collaboratively to identify and assess needs, plan and design differentiated high-impact teaching strategies and reasonable adjustments, to support implementation of strategies and adjustments, to undertake reviews. SLPs are part of the intentional and explicit school improvement.
So now I'm going to discuss what is speech and language. So speech, language, and communication skills are the building blocks for students to achieve their full potential at school, socially, within the community, and post-school. So these are the skills that underpin literacy and numeracy development and are needed for students to succeed in all learning areas. So I'm going to break down into what speech, language, and communication is. So language is the comprehension and use of words and sentences to convey ideas and information. Speech is the production of vocal sounds, a process that involves both motor, articulatory, and linguistic skills. Language and speech are therefore both facets of communication, which encompasses the broader set of non-verbal and verbal means of conveying information and emotions. So the term speech, language, and communication difficulties is a broad term used to refer to those who have specific difficulties in one or more aspects of speech, language, or communication. So this diagram is a good visual representation of the relationship between speech, language, and communication. So our largest circle represents speech, language, and communication difficulties. And within this circle, we have the areas of language, including language use, grammar, vocabulary, verbal learning. And on the other side, we have speech, sound production, articulation. These overlap when it comes to phonology. Floating in the broader area of communication are the areas of fluency and voice down the bottom. So we'll come back to this visual representation a couple of times. So just to clarify, speech and language are two separate areas. Speech is the way we produce sounds together and the sequencing of those sounds to form words, and language involves the exchange of ideas and meaning.
Speech may be defined as the production of vocal sounds, a process that involves both motor or articulatory and linguistic skills. Speech production is an intricate process involving many steps, and a breakdown at any step along the way may result in a speech sound disorder. Next. Speech sound disorder refers to difficulties producing the sounds that make up words. Speech sound disorders may be due to a range of different underlying causes, including difficulties with phonology, which are the rules of speech sounds in words, or difficulties with muscle coordination. Speech sound disorders can impact the people's understanding of the student and can be linked to difficulties with learning to read and spell. Examples of speech sound errors include substituting sounds in words, for example, wed for red, deleting sounds from words, for example, tar for star, difficulties with longer words like hospital for hospital, and slurred or distorted speech. There are more presentations of speech sound disorders. These are simply a few examples. The term speech sound disorder is an umbrella term comprising difficulties in perception, motor production, and phonological representation of speech sounds and speech segments, including phonotactic rules governing permissible speech sound sequences in language. Now, this is a clear model that details the different types of speech sound disorders. So there's functional speech sound disorders, motor and neurological speech sound disorders, structural and sensory or perceptual, and those latter three come under organic. Now we will be focusing on functional speech disorders, which are those that have no known cause. So the first is articulation. So we produce or articulate the sounds of speech by moving body parts and thereby making air move. Most of the movements for speech take place in the mouth and throat and the chest, where breath is controlled. The principal articulators are the tongue, lips and lower jaw, the teeth and the soft palate and the uvula and the larynx or the voice box. Difficulties in articulation are characterized by perceptually inaccurate productions of target sounds. A child who presents with an articulation disorder produces the correct sound inaccurately. For example, an interdental lisp, the sound for the S. The second is phonology. So phonology is a branch of linguistics. It is concerned with the study of sound systems of languages. The aims of phonology are to demonstrate the patterns of distinctive sound contrasts in language and to explain the ways speech sounds are organised and represented in the mind. The correct use of speech sounds within a language requires knowledge of the sounds of the language and the rules that govern their production and combination, and this is called phonology. Phonological disorders are very common. A child who presents with a phonological disorder will often produce accurate sounds in the wrong places or omit sounds. For example, tat for cat or bow for boat.
So now I'm going to discuss the area of language in more detail. So language is the comprehension and use of words and sentences to convey ideas and information. When we look at the diagram again, this is the left side, which includes language use, grammar, vocabulary, verbal learning, and phonology. So we can talk about language in two broad categories that you may have already heard: receptive language and expressive language. Receptive language is comprehension or listening. It's the ability to understand language, including directions, concepts, and sentence structures. Expressive language is production or speaking. It is the ability to express, including naming, using words, grammar, sentence structure, and telling stories. We can also look at language in terms of these three areas, which are form, content, and use. So form is the structure of language and includes phonology, which concerns the sound system, morphology, which relates to structure of words, and syntax, which is how words are arranged into sentences. The next area is content or semantics, which relate to the meaning of language, and the last area is use or pragmatic language, which is the force behind all language and involves rules of communication.
All right, so children with language difficulties can present in many different ways. Firstly, here are some examples of difficulties in language form. Erroneous production of words, for example, drawed for drew. Poor use of grammar, for example, pronouns, tense and plurals. Speaking only in simple sentences or incomplete sentences, or difficulties using conjunctions. Incorrect word order. omissions and addition of words in sentences, poor understanding of language due to difficulties interpreting different sentence structures, and difficulties comprehending the meanings of morphological markers such as past tense ed, irregular past tense, plurals, pronouns, and comparative or superlative forms. Secondly, difficulties in language content may present as word finding difficulties, use of basic vocabulary only and non-specific language, for example, the word stuff, difficulties conveying meaning to listeners, tangential and convoluted sentences, excessive use of filler words such as and are, poor storytelling, difficulties using figurative language, idioms and sarcasm, and poor understanding of language due to a limited vocabulary. Finally, a child with struggles in language use may have difficulties with starting and keeping conversations going, asking for help when they do not understand, using the correct language for the situation, for example, using slang language when talking to a teacher, identifying if conversation partners do not understand what is being said, and using metalinguistic skills to interpret abstract information, inferring meaning from non-literal language, understanding and using cohesive devices, ellipsis and humour.
So now I'm going to talk about the importance of speech and language. So, speech-language communication difficulties have a significant impact on students' access, participation and achievement at school. All Queensland State School students have a right to a high-quality education with reasonable adjustments made to enable students of all abilities to access and participate in education and the curriculum and achieve to their full potential. So, speech-language communication needs impact on a range of areas, and I'm going to talk about a few, including the first one, learning. So a lot of classwork is done by talking. If a student is struggling to participate in the classroom discussions, then they're going to struggle to access learning. It can also impact the area of literacy. So language is the foundation for learning to read and write. Language is needed to understand what is read, as well as linked to decoding. Also, students need language, words and sentences before they can write them on the page. Social relationships. It can be really hard to join in conversation and understand what others are saying, and this can make it hard to make and keep friends at school. Mental health. Language can also be hard to feel good about yourself when school is really challenging and you feel socially isolated and you're not able to communicate with your peers. And behaviour. A big one. We tend to act differently when we are struggling to understand or feel misunderstood. If we don't have the language to communicate, then expressing ourselves through actions is the next logical step. I've just got here some facts about speech-language communication, and this is further evidence of why we are talking about speech and language today. So it actually has been estimated that between 22.3 and 24.5% of Australian children actually have speech language or communication disorder when they start school. Speech language communication difficulties are very closely linked, as I said before, to behaviour, to social skills, to self-esteem and social relationships. Language underpins all of these. Communication skills are a big predictor in later reading skills. Children with poor language reading abilities are 6 times more likely to encounter reading problems than those without. In a study of pupils at risk of exclusion from school, 2/3 of these were found to have speech-language communication needs. That's a very high percent. 81% of children with emotional and behavioural disorders have significant unidentified communication needs as well. And that one down the bottom says that 2 children in the average classroom actually have developmental language disorder, according to the statistics.
Okay, so helping children to develop their speech and language skills is something that can happen every day in the most natural of settings. Our 5 big tips for facilitating communication are to respond with interest to whatever they tell you, with or without words. They can communicate without using their words. Talk frequently about things interest to them, have conversations that go back and forth a number of times, talk at a level that they can understand and learn from that's not too hard or too easy, and show ways, especially with books, but also without, just about the book. Okay, we can communicate without using words, and some children may be communicating messages using a combination of sounds and gestures like pointing or shaking their head or waving, and eye gaze by looking at objects or to you. Here are some strategies for these communicators.
Sorry.
Okay, so you could sing simple songs with actions, and chances for participation leads to turn taking and increased vocabulary. Add words to their messages. Put into words what you think they are telling you. Listen and wait, giving a chance to initiate to communicate and look interested. Use fun words. When playing, can use intonation and repeat a lot. Imitate sounds and actions to keep the interactions going, and talk during everyday routines and activities using the same vocabulary so the child has repeated exposures. Use gestures and actions when you're talking, as this helps the child to get the message. Offer choices, which shows the power of communication to the child, and be face-to-face so that they can see and hear you better. It builds a stronger connection and you can notice their attempts to communicate. And ask less questions. Use comments and statements instead. Okay, so some children will have started to use single words or started to put words together, like dog or mummy go. And here are some strategies for these communicators. There are many different kinds of words, not just the names, but also actions and descriptions, and make sure you use all of them. Get on the same level as the child so that they can see you. Again, it helps you to notice when they're communicating. If there's an error, there's no need to correct it. Just repeat the word or phrase correctly and continue along with the interaction. Encourage pretending. This builds language skills. Use simple pretend toys and join in the play, but follow the child's lead without your own agenda. Make a guess when you don't understand. Use the context and the child's eye gaze. Ask choice questions between two items. Okay, so when they both hear and see the options, it's easier to respond. Use familiar daily routines. Pause at a key moment or interrupt the routine to prompt the child to take a turn. Expect words sometimes, but not others. So the child needs a lot of practice before they can use the vocabulary. Use gestures to bridge the learning of new words. And when you say a word, or when the child says a word, you expand on their message. Once children talk in sentences consisting of a few or many words, try to then build on their communication development. Here's some ideas. Expand vocabulary by introducing new words into daily routines. Repeat each time and use in many contexts. Use routines to encourage back and forth conversations. Give chance, starts conversations, wait silently, and once they show and tell, comment with interest. Encourage pretend play. Use flexible book reading. Follow the child's lead, and you don't need to read the book cover to cover. Just if they have a particular interest on one page, you can spend a greater deal of time on that page. Make sure you're being interactive during book reading. Talk about the reasons for seeing things and the world around the child so that they can build an understanding of it. Encourage stories. You need to be clear and use specific language, and talk about stories related to the family members around the child and events that they are experiencing. talk about the print that they see every day. We make the alphabet meaningful by pointing out letters in texts that are seen everywhere, and show that words are made up of sounds, as this is valuable when learning to read, and encourage experimentation with writing and provide materials during pretend play.
Right, so I'm going to very briefly touch on the project that Eloise and I are currently working on in the CQ region, which is ERTL, which is our early years resource for talking and listening. So here is ERTL the Turtle. So this project has come from our significant work and support of oral language in the early years within our region, and a request for a resource to support teacher capability in this area. So our goal with ERTL is to increase teachers' knowledge, skills and confidence to appropriately target and support early language development in the schools within the early years, and to also engage home support of language as much as possible. So our scope, to create a CQ departmental resource that is going to assist teachers to actually develop communication skills in the early years classroom and at home. So it's going to have very flexible implementation with a focus on providing opportunities for teachers to develop intentional language-focused teaching and learning for our students. So we're going to focus on 4 evidence-based strategies introduced and repeated to staff, with resources provided to increase teachers' knowledge, skills and confidence in the use of these strategies to appropriately target and support early language development. So the resources for each of our strategies are going to include 2 texts provided with embedded shared book reading strategies as well, 4 play-based activity ideas with target strategy embedded throughout and lots of opportunities, 2 home activity ideas with target strategy embedded to ensure that inclusive family partnership, and 2 routine ideas to encourage frequent use of that target strategy throughout as much as possible in our routines. We're also hoping to develop some monitoring tools to look at the effectiveness of our resource, which will include a teacher and parent questionnaire to monitor the capability development progress, hopefully beginning, middle and end of using the resource, and a tool to monitor the actual students' communication milestones as well at the beginning and end, which will hopefully inform transition statements as well. So we'd just like to note that our project heavily aligns with not only our Central Queensland Regional Operational Plan, but also the statewide strategic plan, including a great start for all children, every student succeeding, and the Connect for Children as well. So I just thought I'd quickly go through a little bit of an example of one of our focus strategies and the associated resources. So we're obviously very much in the middle of development. This is just an example, but our strategy 1 of the 4 is observing, and that's getting to know how they talk. So this strategy is all about understanding how your learner communicates. When we understand how our learner is communicating, we can use then other strategies, which we'll introduce in the other strategy focuses, to build on what they say. So our text focus for that week, with the provided texts, are going to be about pausing and looking for communication behaviours while reading those texts and any other texts. The activity 1 is a feeding game, which is again providing lots of opportunities to observe, to wait, to look at what your learner is doing and communicating, and look for those communication behaviours. Activity 2 is a building food game with again lots of opportunities to really observe how the student or the learner is actually communicating with you, whether that is with words or without words. And then our home activity is dinner talk, which is obviously meal times are very common at home. So utilising that time at dinner for the parents to actually observe and look at how the their child is communicating and what they're telling them during dinner time. And then our routine idea is obviously meal times. So you can see a bit of a theme there, and we are hoping that each of our opportunities to build capacity in those communication strategies are going to be very themed, so that it all fits together nicely and is nice, usable resource. So that's the end of our presentation for today. Thank you so much for your time and for listening. If you do have any questions, feel free to email them through to us. Our emails are just there on the slide now. So my one is bmcin102.
And mine is ebowe49.
And we've just got some references here for the end of our presentation. Thank you so much again for your time today.